you see it.
Okay.
Right, we are live now. So yeah, just pause when it's there. Get everything set up, and while that's doing that, I'll just get this out to social media. Twitter. I know you are on Instagram as Typhoon Book, aren't you?
I am, yeah. Yeah, I mainly use Twitter, to be honest. Oh, I've still got 20 seconds to go, it's showing on the YouTube video.
Yeah, it should be there now for you, so just pause that as soon as you're ready.
Yeah, it's still saying it's counting down from 14 seconds.
Oh, it should be there. Maybe refresh it. You can do that. Does that work for you? I know you are on Instagram.
Yeah, we're good. That's all working.
Right, perfect. So, for those who are just joining us, as you know, it takes a bit of time just before everything gets settled and we get out to social media. But I'm going to get started. But Mike, yeah, what have you been up to since the last time we chatted at Boscombe? Because it's been a couple of weeks now.
Yeah, it has. I've been doing a bit of flying, actually.
Oh, nice.
So I work for a company called Draken and now fly Falcon business jets that are modified. So they've got a load of electronic warfare kit in the back. And we've been doing a lot of work with the Air Force, flying against the F-35s and the Typhoons over the North Sea,
Nice.
and also the Navy warships, mainly over the Channel. We act as aggressors to them, really, so sort of pretend enemy. We do red air, everything from radar calibration trials right through to sort of pretending to be fulcrums and flankers and things. So I've been doing a bit of that, which has been good fun.
Brilliant. But guys, get your questions in. But if you haven't read Mike's book or watched the interview, can you just give us a couple of minutes background and also chat about the book while the questions come in?
Yeah, so Mike Sutton, and I left the Air Force 4 years ago. I was very lucky with my career as a Jaguar pilot on one of the last Jaguar courses and did the very last Jaguar QI course. Before that, I followed the normal sort of RAF training system of Bulldogs on the University Air Squadron, then Tucanos, and then I was really lucky and got selected to go out to Canada to fly the Hawk 115 before hitting the Jag OCU, and that was great because all my mates were going off to Valley to fly the T1s, and then a few of us were selected to go and fly the HUD-equipped glass cockpit Hawks out in Canada, so that was great. A couple of tours on the Jaguar, and then on the first Typhoon multi-role squadron, 11 Squadron, back in 2007, 2008. I then ran the Typhoon QI course, did a couple of staff jobs, and ended up as a boss of one squadron. And I was in charge of the Typhoons when we went out to Iraq and Syria for the first time in the operations against ISIS in 2015. I then did a tour in the MOD, strategic planning, and left. After that, thinking I'd had enough of desk jobs and I didn't want another 20 years of HQ jobs in the Air Force, so got the commercial pilot's license. And then during lockdown, I found a diary that I'd kept while as the boss of one squadron out in Iraq and Syria, and decided to write it up. Not with the intention of it becoming a book, just turned some pencil scribbles into a Word document, and that's how it all began. So I started writing. Some friends read it, a couple of family members read it, said keep going, and then it kind of grew wings from that and turned into a book, which has been on the streets now for a few months.
Yeah, and I've read it and it's absolutely brilliant, so go and get that, and the link is in the description and you can see the cover on the left hand top of the screen there. But Mike, you can see there's some questions going in, so remember to scroll to the top and enjoy and get your questions coming in, folks.
Okay, so here we go. First one from Matt Jones, who couldn't make it. Would a Hawk fitted with an EJ200 engine beat a Typhoon to 30,000 feet? I have absolutely no idea about that. I've got a degree in philosophy and I'm okay at flying planes, but I'm terrible at building them. So I'd have to defer to some sort of aeronautical engineer to answer that question. I don't even know if the engine would fit in, but it would be a pretty good race. Right. Bill, what did you think of the Adore engine? Some critics rendered the Jaguar underpowered. I like the way that you've used the word critics there, actually, because I'd say that the Jag being underpowered was probably more accepted wisdom rather than a criticism. The Jaguar, as many of you will know, was originally designed just as a training aircraft, and it had quite good performance. And then, after that, people decided that actually it could become a strike aircraft. and kitted it out with fuel tanks and bombs and rockets and missiles and cannons and all sorts of stuff. The result of that really was that there's an awful lot of drag and weight on the aeroplane that was never really designed to be there. Yet the sort of fundamentals of the wing and the engine, all the rest of it stayed pretty much the same. So yeah, it was a little bit underpowered. And one of the most interesting things I think about getting airborne was the speed at which you had to take off, which is sort of in the 180 knot bracket, so 200 miles an hour or so. And going down the runway at Colchester, there was never a lot of runway left before you got the nose up and kind of hauled it into the sky. I had to do a high-speed abort once where a flock of pigeons flew across the nose of the airplane just about rotate speed, and I'd sort of heard about and seen the issues of going single engine or losing your engines after takeoff. So I decided to stop the takeoff at that point, and you had a half-second reaction time to from the rotate to make your decision to stop. And so I just threw the parachute out the back, got the hook down straight on the brakes, and I took the cable at about 160 knots at Colchester, and the nose of the engine the nose of the aircraft was just hovering over the grass at the end. So I had a pretty lucky escape there. So yeah, I would say it was a little bit underpowered. But when you got it up to speed, it was great. It was really happy at sort of 450, 500 knots. You could put a bit of G, and it was great for just snaking through the hills and flying around at low levels. So great at speed, maybe not quite as good when you're slow speed. Alba Ratman, and I apologize if I get any pronunciations of names wrong. I'll do my very best. Whom do you consider your greatest adversary in a 1v1 fight with another Jag on your 6 and 41 days? Okay, so my greatest adversary in a Jag doing air combat was basically any other aircraft that wasn't a Jag. But in terms of the pilots, it was normally the wily kind of older Jag pilots who would, I'm going to say break the rules, but slightly kind of push the limits in terms of how much G they pull, or you weren't allowed to deploy flap in the Jag, but I know that a couple of the sort of senior guys did deploy a little bit of flap when they're doing air combat. So anyone who had a couple of thousand hours on that aeroplane would normally be flying the airplane a bit better than us youngsters. Hope that answers your question. Bill, you got the book. Brilliant. Well done. I really hope you enjoy it. And if you like it, please leave a review. It's great to see some reviews on Amazon. Thank you for those of you who've done one of those. Right. So Gash PL, I think, is the name of the next question. With all the BVR missiles, do you think that dogfighting still needs to be learned by the pilots? I'm just going to say yes, because if you don't do it and you end up in a merge and you haven't practiced dogfighting, then you're going to lose. And so it's one of these questions where there are so many scenarios you can have with combat aircraft, everything from doing electronic attack with radars, beyond visual range fighting, close air support, defensive missions, reconnaissance task, all this sort of stuff. And all of them have got their own discrete, kind of nuanced, aspects and skills. And dogfighting's one of them. I know that, it's a great interest about which aircraft is the best and who's maneuverable. And I think that sometimes the debate maybe focuses too much on that because that's much less common. But it's still a core skill set for pilots to learn how to maneuver their airplane and max perform their airplanes. And I can see a scenario where you could end up in a merge, and we're seeing stuff over, in Eastern Europe at the moment, which is unexpected. I think with MiG-29s and flankers, and so that there is absolutely that need for pilots to be able to max perform their airplane. If they get into a fight, if they get into a merge, and they need to be able to do that. So I would say yes, but it's not as much as a priority as other things. And actually, as a multi-role pilot, and I'm sure everyone who's done that sort of flying would agree that one of the main challenges is how do you retain a competency in all of those different skill sets. And some people are naturally better at something than something else, clearly, just like any walk of life. on the Typhoon Force, we had a system of currencies where not only did you have to do a certain number of ILSs in a month, and instrument approaches and circuits and all that sort of stuff, emergency simulators, but you also had to do a certain number of all of your tactical disciplines. So to remain current and deployable for combat, so if you're a high readiness pilot, then you had to have achieved a certain number of sorties that were to the sufficient standard in offensive counter-air, night close air support, dogfighting, strafing, dropping practice weapons, all of that sort of stuff had a currency. And so when you came back from a sortie, you chalk it up on the computer, and it would go into a database, and you could sort of check how everyone was in terms of their currencies. And the flying program that comes out every week that drives the training is quite scientific, because it's got to be written so that squadron's getting the objectives done that it needs to do. So it's not just a case of, right, there's 5 jets on the line, let's just go do some flying today. The programmers will look at it the week or two before and say, right, well, this person needs to go to the tanker because they haven't done that for ages. This person's on a pairs lead workup and needs to do some dissimilar air combat. This person's doing some defensive counter-air. So we'll need tankers, we'll need airspace, we'll need ground control intercepts, we'll need some adversaries. And so you kind of stitch it all together and knit it together into this weekly flying program. And then you just hope that the jets remain serviceable, and you hope that the pilots pass their trips. And then you can kind of retain the currency of the squadron. And you aim off at the next event, be it readiness for operations, be it deploying on shader, quick reaction alert, or a big exercise. Or just training, because guys are always on workups, instructor workups and training courses. So the programming shop is normally a bit of an oven, and it's sort of working hard to make sure that everyone's getting the currencies and the skills and the ticks that they need to keep it going. Right, I think maybe enough of that one. Excuse me, scrolling. Let me just find my place. Byron Farrow, I hear that the business jet aggressors have occasionally had the odd success against latest gen jets. Any stories to tell? Well, look, a gentleman never tells, but what we do is we try to provide realistic training for the RAF frontline, and we've got some reasonably good electronic warfare capabilities. And so what we can do, hopefully, is provide a level of training that the frontline wants. What we could also do is a thing called a PK miss, which is in training when you fire a training missile, a simulated missile, the RAF squadrons will tell the aggressors or the Red Air that you've got a certain number of PK misses today. And what that means is that we can pretend that simulated shot didn't work. So the Typhoon will run in, shoot, crank, and then go out and sort of run cold, run away from us, and he'll say, yeah, that's a valid AMRAAM shot or a valid Meteor shot onto that target. And then we can turn around on the radio and say, well, it's a PK miss. And what that means is that it didn't work and we're still alive. So just occasionally, the aggressors manage to sort of sneak in, but it's with a combination of electronic warfare and, PK misses and all the rest of it. But generally, the biz jets get shot down as you might expect them to do. Byron, and hello from Bucharest. Yeah, hello, Bucharest. Mahad Mirza, like the Rafale F1, which didn't include air-to-ground, were there any tranches on the Typhoon which didn't have air-to-ground? That's a great question. I think the very first Typhoons, they were the Block 1s, which didn't really, the really early Block 1s that we're flying back in 2007, didn't really have much of a capability of anything, to be honest. Then they brought in the Block 2s, which were air-to-air only machines. And 3 Squadron were the first Typhoon Squadron, and they formed up the kind of air defense role and the quick reaction alert role. And those aircraft were just air-to-air initially for the first year or so. I was on 11 Squadron, and we were receiving what was called the Block 5 I don't know what happened to the Block 3 and the Block 4. Maybe someone on the chat will know, but I don't know. But they were called the Block 5s, and they had the paveway capability and the Lightning pod. So they were the first air-to-ground aircraft. And quickly, all the other aircraft that had been produced then kind of got upgraded, if you like, to Block 5 standard. So they were all multi-role. And that's all Tranche 1. So it gets really confusing with tranches and blocks. But I'm just talking about all of the Tranche 1 jets initially had some slightly varying capabilities. I didn't know about the Rafale. I fought Rafale, and I fought it after it had its engine upgrade. So it's a pretty good bit of kit. It could pull, I think, 11G and more alpha. So in air combat, it was a great adversary. Albert, EJ200 will not fit in a Hawk. There we go. You know, the philosophy degree. It was useful after all. Another question, as I recall from your book, you don't have a military family background. Amongst the Air Force and pilots in particular, how typical would you say that was? I think I've got a lot of Army mates as well from doing joint jobs, and loads of Army officers had dads and granddads that were in the Army. So I don't know if it was just my sort of experience, but it seemed to be really common amongst the Army. Amongst the Air Force, there were lots of pilots who were inspired because their uncle was a pilot, you know, or their dad was, or their granddad was. So there's definitely a trend, but it was by no means, you know, everybody. And I think most of my close friends who are pilots don't have dads or mums, you know, granddads who are pilots. So it's definitely out there, but it's not huge. I mean, it is common, but it's not a prerequisite. And I did a cadet talk last week, and it's one of the questions they ask, and I think sometimes it's seen as a blocker in that if you don't have a family background of being in the Air Force or the military, you know, then it's much harder to get in. And I'd absolutely challenge that and say that that's just not the case, which is good news, you know, for everyone who doesn't have that. Great. What else we got now? The Freckled Puny. How big a jump was it from the Jaguar to Typhoon in terms of performance and tech? It was a catastrophic, brilliant jump, and one that I was nervous about because, in fact, every aeroplane that I've started to learn how to fly, I've always been nervous about whether I'm going to pass that course or not. Right from the start, right from the Bulldog, and right, you know, even through to the Falcon, because I hadn't done multi-crew stuff. So I was doing my type rating on the Falcon, going, right, I've got to concentrate, learn this new skill set, don't want to embarrass myself. So that feeling has never gone. So the jump though from the Jag to the Typhoon, I got about just under 1,000 hours on the Jag, so I knew that I could fly, but I'd never done air defense. I'd never flown something that had the sort of high performance of the Typhoon. So, you know, was I going to be able to cope with that? Could I really cope with the 9G? Could I cope with the air defense? It was going to be, you know, a real challenge to learn that. And so, yeah, real nervousness going into it. And I've always coped that by sort of a dedication. You know, when I've struggled with that, it's just a case of kind of getting my head down. And it was the technique that all the other guys and girls used as well. When you go onto an OCU, your social life just kind of narrows, you know, and all you do really is just get your head into the books for a few weeks, get into the simulators. And then as soon as you start to pass the simulators, you get the first couple of trips under your belt on the Typhoon. You think, you know, I might better do this. But if you went to the Typhoon OCU now and spoke to those guys, they'd all have the same answer, that they just want to pass. They just want to get to the end. They just want to get to the squadron. And then when you get to the squadron, you just want to get combat ready. And then when you're combat ready, you just want to become a pairs lead. So there's always these kind of goals that you're aiming at, and you never really, even as the boss of one squadron, I then felt that, well, I wish I was a better fours lead, and, you know, or a better fours plus lead. And, you know, so you're always challenging yourself to kind of get better. But back to the specifics, the jump was huge because the cockpit was completely different. So it was a case of resetting all this kind of autopilot stuff that I'd learned. You know, when I was flying along, you get ingrained and you memorize all your checks, you memorize all your tactics, and it becomes almost an instinctive thing to fly. So when you're going off to the range in the Jaguar, yeah, I think there were like two sides of FRCs of the checks that we had to do, and I can't remember them particularly now, but it was like a mnemonic of these checks, and you just rush through them. and then going to the Typhoon, lose all that, completely different cockpit, new checks, and so you're kind of trying to commit this stuff to memory, and nothing's happening by rote. Everything you're doing, you're having to think about consciously. So I guess people have seen that, even maybe getting into a new car you've never driven before. The first thing you sort of look is, well, where are the indicators and how does that work? And you kind of so you've got all of that to kind of get your head around, whilst learning the new skills as well, and learning the air defense, which is a whole new language. I was used to tactical flying, where you try and get into low level, you look at your radar warning receiver, you kind of try and avoid everything that's having a look at you, and if someone gets really close within visual range, you sort of point at them and have a shot. And then all of the effort was on the air to ground. And in the Typhoon, initially, it was sort of reversed. It was get up to 30,000 feet, get supersonic, select the AMRAAM, and I'll go and find all these other aircraft and learn how to shoot them down. And they're going to be the ones trying to evade you. They're the ones hiding behind the hills and running away. Electronic warfare stuff coming at you as well. So it took a long time. I'd say that by the end of my first tour on the Typhoon, I was doing okay. By the time of my second tour, I was doing the QI core stuff and trying to teach that, and I was starting to get better at. By the end of the third tour, I was feeling a bit more confident. So it takes years really to learn and get really, really good at the air to ground and the air to air. Performance just completely different. I mean, the Jaguar would take 100 miles to get to 15,000 feet, and the Typhoon, you could do it pretty much, after takeoff. And so that first takeoff was just, insane. We're going up at 15,000 feet a minute, in afterburner. I remember actually they brought in a limitation when I was on one squadron, that because of climbing in Class G, they didn't want us to climb in excess of 8,000 foot a minute. And then everyone had just got used to going up at 20 nose up at full power and just blasting away. And we had to lower the nose and slow to 300 knots and only climb at 8,000 foot a minute. And all the pilots were huffing around on a squadron going, what's the point of having a Typhoon if you're going to limit your climb performance? So it's funny what you get used to. And in the Falcon now, I don't see 8,000 feet a minute ever. I hope that answers your question. Right. How are we doing? John Minter, do you think the Typhoon has successfully replaced the Harrier, Tornado and Jaguar in the bomber role? Has it got some limitations? One thing we don't have is mass. So when you had the Jaguar, the Harrier and the Tornadoes, the Air Force had a lot of options. And I think in 1990 odd, it had 33 fast jet squadrons, and that's gone down to a third of that or so now, maybe a little bit less. So what they lose is mass. And the mantra of the Air Force was, you can take an F3 and you can take a Jaguar and you can put them together and you've got a Typhoon. And I kind of see that a bit. That makes sense. In terms of the discrete capabilities, the Typhoon just going through a series of upgrades now, and it's actually a pretty good bit of kit. It's got the Paveway 4 in it. It's got the Brimstone on it. The Brimstone 2 is coming in. It's going to have AMRAAM and Meteor as well. It's flying around with those. It's got the cannon. It's got Storm Shadow as well. So you've got long range standoff cruise missiles. You've got a very modern version of the AMRAAM and the Meteor and the ASRAAM. And the ASRAAM's the best IR missile in the world. And you slave that to the helmet mounted sight, and you can take high off bore sight ASRAAM shots if you need to at very long range, beyond visual range. And so you've got this kind of layered missile system where you've got the really long range of the Meteor, you've got the AMRAAM that does the middle bit but can also go quite short range, and then you've got the ASRAAM as well, which goes quite long range but also uber short range. So you've got some great air defense stuff there. I think there are weapons that the Harrier, Tornado and Jag carried that the Typhoon doesn't carry, but they're more rockets, dumb bombs, all the precision stuff that those platforms the Typhoon can now do. And I've really struggled to see a scenario where the Air Force would go back to using non-precision weapons. It would have to be some sort of doomsday thing. I think the world is using precision now. You look at the horror of what's happening in Ukraine, and when you don't use precision weapons, and I think the West expects us to be precise now, and we can, and they are expensive, but but precision is absolutely the way to go. So I don't think really that in terms of getting an effect on the ground, that there's any less capability now with the Typhoons. I think it's better, it's enhanced, and with the EA capabilities of the new radar, really you're going to do a whole lot of new things that those platforms couldn't do. The other weapon that's coming is a thing called Spear 3, which is a long-range mini-cruise missile that can go a really long way and data link to the F-35s. So the F-35s can be getting very close to threat systems. The Typhoons can lob off a load of Spear 3s, and the F-35s can pick them up and then actually steer them into targets when they get closer in. So that's a really good capability. That's a swarming weapon, and that can take out high-end surface-to-air missiles. So, no, I think we're on a really good track with the Typhoon and the F-35. It's a great combination. You've got 4th and 5th gen, and we're seeing all the high-end air forces like the Aussies, like the Americans, keeping that 4th and 5th gen mix. So I think it's in a really great place. I'd say the one area where we're slightly lacking is just in resilience, and by that I mean numbers. And right now out the door, you've got the Typhoon force is hugely committed to the air policing missions, and I think the Air Force is using everything it's got to the max. So numbers probably is the only thing that that we're struggling with a bit. Hope that answered your question. Right. Sorry, let's scroll up a little bit. I've just lost my place. Jafasco, in terms of operations, are the Typhoons and F-35s easily compatible? Yes, they are. They can data link together, and the Typhoons and the F-35s will work together doing missions on an almost daily basis around the UK. And then the air forces will go and do combined exercises in Europe, in America, further afield, where they'll practice with each other, handing off targets, working together, working in the same airspace. And it's really important that you have the same standard operating procedures so that you're speaking the same language, you've got similar tactics, and essentially so that you can just integrate effortlessly come the day when you need to. And I've seen this firsthand with operations myself when you're working with other countries' aircraft, Rafales and Harriers and F-18s and F-15s and F-16s. You can all talk a common language, and then when you're on operations, you can talk to each other. You can. I've dropped weapons where the laser spot has been from another platform and from an unmanned air vehicle as well, and they've guided in weapons that I've dropped. And likewise, I've used my laser targeting pod to highlight targets to other platforms, and we've gone through the whole kind of attack coordination thing together. So I think that the big exercises, the red flags of this world, provide the perfect opportunity for all the coalition assets to get together and to work and to learn from each other. And it's not to say that everyone does exactly the same role. I mean, you look at something like the Growler, it's very much an electronic warfare platform. The F-35s, it's a low observable platform. F-22s, low observable air defense. They try their hand at close air support a little bit, but that's not really their primary role. So platforms are suited to different missions and different roles, but where they overlap, where that Venn diagram overlaps, then it's really important that they all kind of link together. And from what I've seen, it all works pretty nicely. A question from Scotscan. Hello, Mike. Did you conduct many QRA scrambles from Lossy? Actually, from Lossiemouth, not that many. A little bit, mainly training scrambles. The Russians did come over a little bit though, and certainly my squadron were involved in a few, going finding bears, intercepting them off the north coast. And we worked with Coningsby. I did quite an interesting intercept from Coningsby once a few years before, where an American Airlines 757 had a suspected hijacking. So I was sat on the ground at Coningsby with a chap called Ian Lang, who is OC operations. And the telebrief crackled to light, and it was the GCI saying that there was reports of a potential hijacking on this airplane that was just coming in over Wales, and that they might need to scramble us. So we kind of stood up and did up the G suits and got ready to launch. But quite often these things come in and they get turned off again quite quickly because aircraft regain comms if they've lost comms, or intelligence, suggests that it's not what it thought. So most days you'd think you were going to do something, and then most of the time it was turned off. But this one didn't. The telebrief crackled to life. Scramble, scramble, scramble. Vector southwest, climb flight level 350, and we got the scramble message. The other aircraft was still was broken and wasn't able to go. And so Ian just looked at me and said, "Well, off you go then." So I ran out to the airplane and scrambled, headed southwest, and found the 757. And it was a pretty murky old day, and it was on its way into Heathrow. So that was an interesting afternoon. I found this thing on the radar, in and out of the cloud, quite poor visibility, and found this huge airliner and sort of saddled behind it. And one of the things you do is you don't really want to get seen, you don't want to alarm anyone, and you don't want them to know that you're there. So did a low visibility sort of intercept on it, and then waited behind the aircraft, reported what I could see. And luckily, whatever shenanigans had happened on the airplane had all been controlled, and it made a safe landing into Heathrow. So not quite on short final to Heathrow, but I could see it quite clearly, 10 or 15 miles out, and then hauled off. I was about 4,000 feet following this thing down, and then flew back to Coningsby. And then when I got back, it was on Sky News. I don't know how they got heard about it so clearly. So I watched all this while eating a bit of toast and drinking some tea, watching the Sky News. So that was an interesting day out. Okay, the Frecklepina. If not the Typhoon, would you think the Rafale or the Griffin would be worthy alternatives? So I'm now trying to wonder about which alternatives we're talking about here. So maybe hit me with if you could just clarify the question, that would be great. The current situation may loosen some purse strings. Another squadron of new build Typhoons or another squadron of F-35s, which would you buy? That's really interesting. I don't know. I think what the Air Force needs to do, and the Navy obviously, because it's got a dog in the fight with the F-35s, is look at F-35 in the round and under the banner of a thing called FCAS, which is Future Combat Air System, and look not just about this year, because whatever you buy isn't going to be in this year. It's going to take a few years. You then got to resource more engineers, more pilots. So I think they need to take a strategic look at what the next few years, next 5 years, next 10 years is likely to have in store. And then once you've got these airplanes in, you've got them for the next 20 odd years. So we've got to take a long-term look at what we think the force balance is going to look like in probably 10 years time, and work out where that money is going to be spent best. So maybe more Typhoons. F-35A would be quite an interesting prospect, a bit more legs, stick it on a land base, can carry a little bit more. Or do you just say, do you know what, we're not going to spend any more money on these, we're going to put all the money into the future, into Tempest or whatever that thing's going to be called, and spend the money there. So yeah, hopefully there's a bit more money for defence. I don't really know which side I'd come down on for that. I think if you force me, I'd probably say get a few more F-35s, because we don't have a huge amount at Marham, and it would be quite nice to see maybe another squadron of those to boost with the squadron of Typhoons that we've got. Next question, was air-to-air refueling challenging? Do you use rudders during that process? Oh my God, air-to-air refueling. Yes, it was always challenging. It was always emotional. It always got the heart going. And anyone who says it doesn't was just obviously a way better pilot or a liar. There are days when it was, you always got some pleasure out of it, but it was more relief when you plugged and then you could watch the fuel gauge counting up, and then you just think, okay, all I've got to do is formate now. Because when you're formating and you're in, actually it was okay. In the Typhoon, the Jaguar was challenging because as soon as the thing went into a turn, sometimes you struggled to hold your speed in the turn, and because you're already at quite high alpha, you then struggled to then put the burner in to give you yourself more power. So they had these little switches called part throttle reheat, which gave you like a little bit of burner. So yeah, Jaguar air-to-air refueling was was always emotional. Typhoon, you just had that extra performance, so it made it a little bit easier. You weren't ever struggling to sort of catch up with a probe out or anything like that. One of the tricky things was actually the last foot or so. So finding the tanker, getting behind it, getting up underneath was always fine. It was just that last few feet where the basket is, if you've seen videos of it, it looks stable and fairly easy because you can just kind of stare at the basket on the video. But in real life, you're actually you're focusing ahead on some references on the aircraft itself using the head-up display, and the basket's all kind of happening in the periphery over here. And what happens is, especially if you're in a turn or it's at night or the horizon's not very clear, if you kind of look at the basket, you'll find that the aircraft then loses its formation reference with the tanker, and you'll immediately start to fly away and you'll lose that perfect sort of spot that you've got. So yeah, I've seen some horrendous tanking efforts where people will stare at the basket, they'll lose their reference, they then start to climb or descend or bang, or they'll lunge, they'll get too much power and kind of try and shove the probe in, damage the probe. If you hit the probe on the basket too hard, the probe would just bust and could just break, or it could the basket could sort of flick and then flick back. And I've seen people where that slammed into the airplane. In fact, there was an instance on ops at night where in a thunderstorm or around a thunderstorm, lots of turbulence, and the basket slammed underneath the nose of the airplane on one of the guys and flew into essentially the pitot tubes on the bottom of the Typhoon. They're not quite pitot tubes, but they're similar. And it just bent the metal. I've got photos, and this metal's just bent in half. And then obviously started to lose all the airspeed indications and things. And so that's not a good place to be. So tanking was always tricky. On an operational mission, you'd be doing it 3 or 4 times as well. So, you didn't just have that pleasure once. In turbulence, it was the hardest because the basket would be going up and down maybe by 8 or 10 feet. And you just had to kind of time your run or just wait, give it 5 minutes and just see if it settles down. And sometimes it didn't. And then, you'd see people kind of pull up and try and lunge in and all pretty horrible. One of the worst I saw was one of the guys couldn't plug for 45 minutes and was just onto vapors and about to just find a bit of tarmac and go and land. And it was just an op mission and he just couldn't plug. So yeah, always challenging, always a relief to have done it. And sometimes you'd plug in, you get in, and then the blinking fuel system wouldn't work. And you'd look down at your screen and think, oh no, the pump had broken, or the Typhoon had coloured displays, and sometimes a pump would go amber, and the blinking thing wasn't actually fueling up, so you'd have to unplug, and then the guys on the Voyager would recycle the pressure or whatever they do. Then you'd have another go. So sometimes it was 2 for the price of 1. And actually, when I finished flying fast jets for the last time, I thought, well, I'm never going to have to do night air-to-air refueling ever again. So yes, and second part of your question, do you use rudders? No, never use rudders. Really didn't use rudders in the Typhoon at all. And if you push your foot forward on the rudder, it would give you a bit of nose, and it would actually then fade it out again because it really didn't like the rudder at all. So you could keep your foot there to the right, and the jet would kind of, I don't think it really wants that, and it would actually take it off you again. So really, they were just foot rests. Frisian flag. I've never done a Frisian flag. A great exercise. Lots of F-16s and things over the North Sea. I think it's a really good exercise, really high end, lots of air-to-air, but I've never actually done that one personally. Damien Burke. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of water. In the Cold War, the Jag was one of the more survivable jets given the low-level role. Small size, decent speed. How safe did you feel in that sort of war? Well, luckily the Cold War never became hot. So I think, I've only ever trained in, and really, the intense pressure had gone from that by the time I was flying the Jag. So I never really thought I'd have to go up against a flanker or something in a Jag. It felt like, a really bizarre set of circumstances for that to happen. So I always felt relatively safe against, that sort of threat. And maybe that was a bit naive of me. I think the most likely mission that the Jag was doing was all the reconnaissance stuff over in northern Iraq, and if there are going to be any more operations other than the Northern Watch stuff when I was there, then it would be in that sort of role, close air support. So I think the most vulnerable, or the threat that I felt that was most serious, was from the surface-to-air missiles in the Jag. It didn't have the most novel electronic warfare sort of protection systems, ESM systems, had a radar warning receiver, it had a jamming pod, you had some chaff, but it wasn't hugely modern. So I think, yeah, fast and low would have been your safest bet in the Jag. Typhoon, very different, and the electronic warfare system, the DAS in the Typhoon, is absolutely fantastic. 360 high angle of arrival, very, very good self-protection jamming capability. So a different league, actually. And in the Typhoon, you've also got the towed radar decoy as well, which the F3 had. So a great bit of kit. So if you were involved in an engagement, then hopefully the missile will bite off on that thing as well and give you a few more moments to evade. Bill, do you think we have too few UK air bases for survivability? I think what Russia's doing now, and looking further east, and China's resetting probably slightly how we'll think about defence going forward. And maybe there's been a little bit of complacency. I think there are some good lessons from the Cold War about dispersal, and lots of European countries have got motorways and long stretches that are of roads that could be used as sort of temporary landing strips and things. And the UK, to my knowledge, never went down that line. It's certainly nothing we ever spoke about in training. And I think it's just a bit of a shame, really, that under various reviews over the last decades, and remember this hasn't happened quickly or recently, everything's just got piled into 2 or 3 main operating bases. I think particularly Brize Norton. If the Brize Norton runway shut, well, then you've stopped all your air mobility and transport in a oneer, and that does seem like not the greatest idea. Freckle Puny, do you think the RAF retired the alarm unwisely? Do you think the Typhoon could do something like alarm? Well, the alarm was an okay bit of kit. I don't think in actual reality it was the greatest anti-radiation missile. The harm itself is quite old now, but still a decent bit of kit. I think there has been a gap. There's undoubtedly been a seed gap in our capabilities. And whenever we've gone on to big exercises like the Red Flags, and we've done the simulated missions against IADs and things, it's always been, well, the Americans have got to take care of that. So there has been a gap. That is being addressed, though, with 2 things. The first one is, obviously F-35 means you can get a lot closer. But from a Typhoon perspective, the new radars will give you an electronic attack capability against radars and surface-to-air missiles. And also the Spear 3 weapon is being designed specifically against the surface-to-air missile threat, amongst other threats. And so there has been a gap, and I think that the next few years should see the Air Force having a capability that arguably should have been in a few years ago. Josh Bayliss. Hi, Mike. As someone aspiring to be an RAF pilot, I found your story very inspiring. Thank you very much. Do you think the Jaguar would have been better suited for Afghanistan than the Harrier? I love the Jag, and it was a great bit of kit, but the Harrier is a great aeroplane as well. And especially when the Harrier went out at the start, when the runways were all in a terrible state, it had that kind of short takeoff landing capability that the Jag didn't have. So the Harrier was definitely the better platform at the start of the campaign. And then when you roll it on and the runways got longer, what would the Jaguar have added that the Harrier couldn't already do? And I think really you've got very similar platforms there in terms of the effects that they could deliver. And they ended up, they're both carrying dumb weapons, rockets, Paveway 2s, and the Harrier had the Paveway 4 put on it. They both had the same sort of pods. I think the Harrier had sniper on it latterly. So it was a really good close air support aeroplane. So much as I love the Jag, I think it'd be fair to say the Harrier had Afghan pretty sewn up. Or the GR4. Well, I'm not going to go down the line of whether the Harrier should have been retired, because I know that's controversial. And I think the argument at the time really was that the Tornado had this sort of strategic capability with the Storm Shadow, and it could last a little bit longer potentially as well. But then you've lost something that can deploy off a boat. So hugely controversial. If I'm being kind, I'd say that sometimes defence has got to make difficult choices, and I wouldn't have liked to have been the person that signed off on that one. Right, sorry, just scrolling down again. Did I ever fire Storm Shadow? No, I didn't. Storm Shadow came into onto the Typhoon infantry, as did the Brimstone, just as I was leaving. So when I was in the MOD, I could see these things getting rolled out, and it was brilliant to see. And the Air Force could have brought all this onto Typhoon years ago. It could have brought the Storm Shadow, paved way forwards, and the Brimstones in earlier. But it was just a question of why do they need to do it when the Tornado's already doing it? So sometimes there's a criticism leveled at the Typhoon, which is that it only came in after the Storm Shadow only came in after the GR4 had been retired. That's not quite true. The Storm Shadow capability was on the Typhoon, or could have been put on the Typhoon years earlier, but Defence just decided, look, there's no point investing millions of pounds on the Typhoon to get this capability in when it's already in, and we'll just use the Tornado. So actually they dovetailed it quite nicely. So as one platform left, the next one picked it up. So sometimes there is a bit of method in the madness, even though, back in 2012, 2013, you occasionally take the odd hit, from a Tornado mate who's saying that the Typhoon's not that capable. But I think it's just it's a kind of funding line thing, and they max out the development of these platforms. Everyone's busy working towards targets, and they spend the money and they decide when they're going to do various things. I hope that made sense. What air combat event on the Typhoon did you think, wow, this is a world beater? Was it against F-16s, F-15s or MiGs? Personally, I had a moment flying against an F-15 when I just saw we did lots of air combat against Typhoons, so Typhoon v Typhoon. And if you had a really good day, you'd win. If you're up against a really good pilot and you had a bad day, you'd lose. And so there was so much skill. It wasn't the aeroplanes weren't always evenly matched. So much of it came down to the environmentals, the handling, how aggressive you were that day, what tactic you were flying, and how good your opponent was. They used to call it cub bashing. If you were flying someone, who's brand new on the Typhoon and only a few hours, and you'd done a couple of years, you could normally beat them. And if they beat you, then you had to go and have a look in the mirror. So Typhoon v Typhoon, when you then flew against a different F-jet, then you really saw the capability of the aeroplane. And against the F-15, it was for me, because I'd for years been had my ass handed to me by F-15s when I was flying the Jag and F-16s. In fact, anything with an F. And the Typhoon was just so maneuverable against the F-15. All you needed to do was put the burners in full backstick, and this is even without a helmet-mounted sight. With a helmet-mounted sight, just looking and you're shooting. So that was my experience. I wasn't involved in the trial against the flankers initially, but that was a 17 squadron thing. They flew against some flankers, and they did well against the flankers as well. And I remember getting a brief on this and thinking, well, that's pretty good if the Typhoon is able to to do well against those. So right from the start, actually, that jet kind of established itself as a really good capable aircraft in that arena. I can't pronounce Vaclav Noha's name because you're from the Czech Republic, so I've done my best. I have read that altitudes above 30,000 feet, the F-15s were a very dangerous opponent for the Typhoon. Is there any truth to this? It all depends. And what we're guilty of sometimes is looking at blue versus blue and trying to make comparisons, when actually what you're really interested in is how would the Typhoons do against the flankers, the Fulcrums, the J-10s, all the sort of potential threat adversaries. And they're the questions that the RF front line's always asking itself. Obviously, you don't get to train against those platforms very much. So you would train against friendly assets and you give them you would give them, the task of simulating potential threat aircraft, and depending on how complex you wanted the sortie, you would cuff them. So if it was a student's first ever go at doing defensive counter-air, his first ever live sortie in a Typhoon, you get the adversary really just to fly in a straight line, and this person could just practice finding them on the radar, making the switch settings. How does it all work? How does it look? Fly the profiles. And then the other end of the scale, you've got your red flags where there's 10 of you or 30 of you flying against dozens of the others. So sometimes the training missions go well and you clean out the picture, and sometimes they go badly. And I've had a couple of times flying a Typhoon against an F-jet, which has got an electronically scanned array radar at me. My own radar's failed and not worked properly, so I've had to turn around. So, in training, you win some and you lose some. And the most important thing is that you always take that back to the debrief, and you have a really honest debrief, and you work out why what's happened is what happened, and what lessons, you can draw out of it. And you sort of share them among your team, among your squadron, among your force. So, yeah, an F-15 with an E-scan was always a tricky opponent beyond visual range. Bill has asked about drones. I'm conscious we've only got about 10 minutes left. Will drones replace aircraft and pilots? Commercial aircraft, your guess is as good as mine. The technology's been there for trains, hasn't it, for a long time, but we've still got drivers on trains. So, commercial aircraft, there's a whole thing about passengers and the risk that you take as a passenger. So I don't know, I'm going to sidestep that question. For combat aircraft, unfortunately, I'm going to say a hearty yes, they will, but eventually, and we're not there yet. Technology always, I think we expect too much from technology right at the start. And so it normally underperforms a little bit at the start, but then it delivers more further on than we can ever imagine. I mean, think about phones, mobile phones, they're everything now, and they do your banking on it, your emails, and you make your phone calls. But when they came out, you could just string a text message together. So I think these things are just going to get more and more capable. The other thing is if you have unmanned combat planes, it's less risky, it's less political risk. You might lose some hardware, but you're not losing people. And so politically, it means that you can use these things, with a slightly different mindset than if you're actually putting your own service people into harm's way. I think you've also got things about endurance. I mean, Global Hawk can fly for way longer than I can because it doesn't need to go for a pee. So I think we'll get to the point where these things can fly, they can pull more G, they can go higher, they can fly longer and faster, and that unfortunately will happen. I think the thing that's holding it back at the moment is the sensors. You just don't quite have that sensor fusion and fidelity and all these things that you do with your combat aircraft, and that's because these things take decades to come in. So no doubt the wizards at BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin and all that, they're designing combat drones now, in the FCAS program and the Tempest. People are talking about that having an unmanned capability. So it is coming. I wouldn't like to say when. I mean, we've got decades more of use out of the F-35s and Typhoons, but certainly, in probably 30 years' time, we'll see just more and more of these things. And yeah, very sadly, I think there will be a time when fighter pilots are a thing of the past. Okay, a question from Byron Farrow about Ukraine and expectations have differed from reality in modern air combat. Yeah, I mean, they have. And I think there's lots of reasons, or rather lots of speculation as to why we haven't seen the Russian Air Force perform maybe as we thought they might. And we, at the moment, really, until the autopsies happened, we can only speculate as to why that is. I think they might have held some stuff back in reserve. They probably don't have the amount of precision weapons that that we thought they might. There's probably a lack of integration being shown between their surface-to-air missiles and their combat aircraft. And I think there's a possibility that maybe they're just not as good as we thought they might be. So Yeah, I mean, I'm watching it as I'm sure you are all with interest, and there's a lot of disinformation flying around as well. So, especially on the social media side, and lots of speculation. So I think really we just need to kind of wait in terms of analysis about the Russian Air Force and just sort of see how it pans out, and look at this. But what's clear is that they are a threat, and NATO is taking a really different approach to how it's contingency planning now than it did a year ago, and so that's pretty interesting.
So, Mike, I'm just going to interrupt you there. As you can see, we've got 5 minutes left. So, do you want to pick a couple of questions while we wrap up this brilliant Q&A?
Okay, John Minter, if you could fly any historic RAF fighter, what would you choose? It'd be the Spitfire. One thing I didn't say on the aircrew interview the other day was how much I like the A10. And when I was flying Jags, I just look at these things and do detachments over to Davis Monthan. I'd love to have done the exchange on the A10. So that's another favourite aircraft of mine. Right, let me just skim these down. What is a supercruise performance of the Typhoon? Doesn't need to be clean. It can supercruise with stores. So yeah, if you've got tanks on, it will supercruise. I think it will probably supercruise with bombs. I'm not sure. I've tried it with weapons, because you've got sort of other limitations and things on there with stores sometimes. But certainly with missiles and tanks, you can supercruise, and it sits there really comfortably, and it's fantastic. Okay, Rafale and Gripen, about comparing them with the Typhoon. Yeah, I mean the Rafale is a similar aircraft. It's multi-role, and really up until now, I think they've I'm a Typhoon fan, but they've got similar capabilities. But what the Typhoon has got now is it's got this huge backing of all these partner nations, and the Rafale is constrained by the amount of money that the French Air Force can put at it, whereas the Typhoon isn't. And so what we're now seeing is the Typhoon just growing. So the Rafale's kind of stopped. The Typhoon is just going to continue to get better and better with the new capabilities, the Spear 3, the radar, etc. So the Typhoon will extend beyond the Rafale now, and it is a better platform in my opinion. Gripen, great aeroplane, much cheaper. I think of it as like a Typhoon Light, like a Diet Coke. Really, really good. It does lack some of the high-end capabilities, but a great platform. The Swedes make good bits of kit. Crikey, what one now? Ground tour with the army. The culture clash. Well, I was out in Afghanistan on a ground tour with the army, so as a kind of fast jet subject matter expert working with them, and it was their headquarters. They were out patrolling. They were facing all the risks, so there wasn't really a culture clash there. It was more a case of, I've got huge respect for the soldiers and what they're doing, and how can I just feed in a really tiny way to just help them get the effects that they want out of the aircraft. And so I did a bit of liaison there. But the army's got a different culture in the round than the Air Force. It's a little bit more traditional, shall we say, in its outlook. Do I love a Prowler? Yeah, Prowler looks like a good aeroplane. Let's keep scrolling down. Is it true the F-16 is far superior to Typhoon at low altitude? My American buddy says Typhoon has no chance. Your American buddy's wrong, Loz, I'm afraid. There's nothing wrong with the F-16. It's a fantastic aeroplane and just keeps getting better and better with the upgrades. But it's just a different generation. And the Typhoon has just got, it's just a newer generation. It's got more thrust and more power. But the F-16 is a great jet. Tomcat, someone says, controlled chaos. Yeah, well, Tomcat, I mean, whenever you hear that word, you just think of Top Gun, right? Who's not looking forward to Top Gun 2 on May the 27th, I think. The paperback of Typhoon comes out the day before Top Gun, so that's why I'm thinking about this. Right. With Draken expanding with the L159, would I consider going back onto fast jets? I've been offered to go and fly the L159s, but they're basing them up in the north, and I'm kind of enjoying my life on the south coast. So maybe if they stuck the L159s done in Bournemouth, I'd give it some serious consideration. But I'm going to stick on the Falcon for the moment. I think I might wrap it up there, Mike, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. And I've got one question before we wrap up. Can we see another book from you in the future?
Another book. I'm taking a little break from writing, but I haven't ruled it out.
Brilliant stuff. Well, Mike, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a great Q&A, and thank you all for joining us wherever you came from today. We had some great questions, and maybe I can twist Mike's arm to come back on for another Q&A at some point this year. But thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that would be a pleasure. I'm really sorry I didn't get to all the questions. I rattled through. I hope I didn't speak too fast, but yeah, I'd be delighted to come back again another time.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Brilliant. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.